In a lab in California, a geneticist stares at a screen filled with millions of tiny data points, and for a moment, he doesn't say anything at all. What he's looking at isn't a diagnosis, and it isn't a discovery of a new disease. It's something stranger. It's a map of a journey that was never supposed to be traceable, written into the DNA of tens of millions of Black Americans is a record that no slave ships manifest, no plantation ledger, no census taker ever fully captured. And when scientists finally built the tools powerful enough to read it, what they found didn't just rewrite family trees. It rewrote the understanding of one of the largest forced migrations in human history. Before we go further, one thing needs to be said clearly because it matters. Science does not compare people against every race on Earth, because race, in the biological sense, does not exist as a genetic category. What actually happened is something more precise and honestly more astonishing. Researchers compared the DNA of Black Americans against detailed genetic reference populations from West and Central Africa, from Europe, and from indigenous America, and cross-referenced the results against centuries of slave trade shipping records. What emerged was a genetic paper trail of forced displacement so detailed that it could tell you, with statistical confidence, which African coastlines your ancestors were likely torn from, centuries before anyone in your family could have known. To understand why this discovery hit like a seismic wave through the scientific community, you have to go back to a night in August of 1619 when a ship called the White Lion dropped anchor at Point Comfort, Virginia. On board were around 20 Africans, kidnapped from a Portuguese slave ship who would become the first recorded enslaved Africans brought to English North America. That single ship was the opening line of a story that would eventually involve more than 10 million African men, women, and children forcibly transported across the Atlantic Ocean, in a system so brutal and so calculated that it would come to reshape entire continents. For nearly 400 years, the specifics of where in Africa individual family lines originated were buried, first by the deliberate erasure of identity that slavery required, and then by the simple passage of time. Names were stripped, languages were forbidden. Family units were broken apart and sold to different plantations, sometimes hundreds of miles from each other, with no possibility of ever finding one another again. For descendants trying to trace their roots, the paper trail didn't just go cold. In most cases, it never existed in the first place. To grasp the scale of what was lost, consider the mechanics of the system itself. Enslaved people were legally classified as property, which meant marriages between enslaved individuals held no legal standing whatsoever, and families could be, and routinely were, separated by sale at any moment for any reason with zero recourse. Historians estimate that roughly 1 in 3 enslaved marriages in the antebellum South was eventually broken up by forced sale, and a similar proportion of children were separated from at least one parent before adulthood. Birth records for enslaved people, when they existed at all, were often kept not in church registries or county courthouses, but in plantation account books, listed alongside livestock and equipment, valued in dollars rather than remembered in names. For the descendants of these individuals, attempting genealogical research centuries later, this created what historians and genealogists have long called a hard wall around the year 1870, the first census in which formerly enslaved people were recorded by name rather than simply tallied as property under someone else's household. Everything before that date, for millions of American families, was effectively unrecoverable through paper records alone. It simply didn't exist in any retrievable form. And that is exactly why what happened in the genetics labs over the past 2 decades feels less like ordinary science and more like something out of a detective story spanning centuries. Researchers realized that even though written records had failed, biology hadn't. Every human cell carries a molecule that doesn't lie, doesn't forget, and doesn't erase itself just because history tried to erase the people who carried it. By comparing long stretches of DNA, geneticists can identify which segments trace back to specific ancestral populations, essentially reading a genome the way a forensic investigator reads a crime scene, piecing together fragments until a picture emerges. The first major studies, published in outlets including the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, found that the median African American individual carries around 18.5% European ancestry, but that number hides an enormous range. Some individuals carried barely more than 1%, others carried well over half. This wasn't a single answer. It was a distribution, and the shape of that distribution told its own story. When later studies expanded the sample size into the tens of thousands and refined the statistical models, estimates settling somewhere between 10 and 25% European ancestry. While in Jamaica it measured closer to 7%, a gap that lines up almost perfectly with the different social and legal histories of slavery in the American South versus the Caribbean. In the United States, laws actively encouraged and even financially rewarded the reproduction of enslaved populations after the international slave trade was formally banned in 1808, while in much of the Caribbean, Brutal working conditions on sugar plantations kept mortality so catastrophically high that plantation owners simply imported more captives rather than relying on births. Two different economic systems, two different survival calculations, and centuries later, two measurably different genetic outcomes sitting quietly in the DNA of the descendants of both. Here's where the first real gut punch of the investigation lands. When scientists dug deeper into how that European ancestry entered the genetic record, they weren't just looking at numbers. They were looking at chromosomes, and specifically at the X chromosome, which is inherited differently by men and women. What they found was a stark and disturbing asymmetry. The African contribution on the X chromosome was consistently higher than on the rest of the genome, which is the genetic signature of something researchers describe with clinical detachment as sex-biased gene flow. In plain language, it means the European ancestry entering African American bloodlines overwhelmingly came from European men, while African ancestry came disproportionately from African women. That is not a neutral historical footnote. That is the DNA equivalent of a courtroom exhibit, silent testimony to centuries of sexual violence committed against enslaved women by the men who claimed to own them. Historians had documented this reality for generations through slave narratives, diaries, and legal records of forced concubinage. But now, the human genome itself was independently confirming it, embedded in the biology of tens of millions of living descendants who had no written record of how or why that ancestry entered their family line. Geneticists studying the data described finding this pattern reflected consistently across nearly every African American population sampled, from the Deep South to the urban North, a signature too widespread and too uniform to be coincidence. Researchers were even able to estimate the male and female contributions separately using markers passed down exclusively through the maternal line and exclusively through the paternal line, and the asymmetry only grew starker. The European genetic contribution traveling through direct paternal lines vastly outweighed the European contribution traveling through direct maternal lines, meaning the biological fathers in this admixture were disproportionately European men, generation after generation, while the biological mothers were disproportionately African women. There is no innocent explanation for a demographic pattern like that repeating itself with such consistency across an entire enslaved population for 2.5 centuries. It is the genetic residue of a power imbalance so total that consent, in any meaningful legal or moral sense, simply did not exist for the women whose bodies carried it forward. But the story doesn't stop at the shores of America. It reaches back across the Atlantic, and this is where the investigation becomes almost cinematic in its detail. In 2020, a team working with genetic data from tens of thousands of research participants published a study in the American Journal of Human Genetics that did something no one had done before at this scale. They didn't just measure how much African ancestry existed in the Togo, Benin, and parts of Nigeria, the region researchers labeled Nigerian, and the Congolese cluster tracing to Angola and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Then they laid this genetic map directly over centuries of shipping manifests, port records, and historical slave trade databases, essentially asking whether the DNA and the paper records told the same story. In most places, they did. In others, they revealed something researchers hadn't expected at all. The first anomaly involved Nigeria. Historical shipping records show that a certain volume of enslaved people were taken directly from ports associated with modern-day Nigeria to the United States. But the genetic data showed something odd. Nigerian ancestors was significantly overrepresented in the DNA of African Americans, far beyond what direct transatlantic shipping numbers alone could explain. For a moment, this looked like a contradiction between biology and history. Then, researchers turned to a data source that had been sitting in archives, underused for decades, the intra-American slave trade. After Africans were forcibly brought across the Atlantic, an entirely separate, brutal secondary market existed within the Americas itself, where enslaved people were resold, transported, and redistributed between colonies, states, and territories, sometimes decades after their initial arrival. And when researchers cross-referenced this internal trade data, the Nigerian ancestry surplus suddenly made sense. Enslaved people with ancestry from the Bight of Biafra region, near modern Nigeria, were disproportionately funneled through this secondary internal market, meaning their genetic legacy became concentrated in the United States in ways the original transatlantic voyages alone never predicted. The DNA had detected a historical event that even many historians had underestimated the scale of. This internal slave trade is sometimes called the 19th century, marching them overland or shipping them by sea from the exhausted tobacco fields of Virginia and Maryland toward the booming cotton frontier of the Deep South. It tore apart families that had, against enormous odds, managed to stay together during the transatlantic crossing itself, only to be broken apart decades later, generations deep into life in America. by the domestic slave markets of cities like Richmond and New Orleans. The genetic data isn't just confirming a historical footnote here. It's providing hard biological evidence for the true scale of an internal trafficking system that, for a long time, existed in the shadow of its more infamous transatlantic counterpart. Then there was the mystery of Senegambia, and this one is harder to sit with. Historical records confirm that a substantial share of all enslaved Africans brought to what would become the United States, especially those forced onto southern rice plantations in places like coastal Georgia and South Carolina, came from Senegambia, a region with deep expertise in rice cultivation that plantation owners specifically and coldly sought to exploit. Given those numbers, researchers expected Senegambian ancestry to be strongly represented in African American DNA today. Instead, they found it strikingly underrepresented, far below what the shipping numbers alone would predict. When the research team tried to explain the gap, every possible answer was grim. One theory pointed to the horrific conditions aboard slave ships originating from that specific region, longer voyage times, and higher mortality rates that meant fewer individuals survived to have descendants at all. Another theory pointed to what awaited survivors after they arrived. Rice plantations were breeding grounds for malaria and other diseases, and enslaved laborers forced to work in flooded paddies faced brutal mortality rates that could have suppressed the survival and reproduction of an entire regional lineage over generations. In other words, an entire strand of African heritage may have been disproportionately erased, not by the passage of time, but by the specific, calculated cruelty of where enslavers chose to send people based on their perceived agricultural skill. If that wasn't enough of a twist, the investigation took an even stranger turn when researchers looked south toward Latin America. Historical shipping records are unambiguous. The overwhelming majority of all enslaved Africans transported across the Atlantic, more than that carried to the United States, were sent to Brazil and other parts of South and Central America. Logic would suggest that African ancestry should be even more concentrated there today than in the United States. Instead, researchers found the biology, but in deliberate social policy. In several Latin American nations, for generations, government and cultural systems actively promoted what was euphemistically specifically designed to dilute African ancestry within national populations over successive generations. The DNA wasn't just recording who arrived. It was recording centuries of subsequent political engineering aimed at erasing a population's genetic and cultural visibility entirely. Now here's where the story pivots into something almost impossible to fully absorb, a mathematical reframing of identity itself. In 2022, a team of population geneticists, including Jaslyn Mooney and Jonathan Pritchard, a name well known in human genomics circles, published a paper that asked a deceptively simple question. Ancestry percentages, the 20% European, 80% African statistics everyone had gotten used to seeing, are useful, but they flatten something enormous. They don't tell you how many actual individual human ancestors those percentages represent. So the team built a mathematical model to answer that exact question for a randomly selected African American born in the early 1960s. Tracing every genealogical line back until it reached a member of an ancestral source population, they calculated that the expected number of distinct African ancestors contributing to that person's genome was 314 individual people. The expected number of European ancestors was 51. Sit with that for a second. Not a percentage, not an abstraction. 314 separate human beings, individuals who lived, breathed, and were forcibly stolen from their homes, all converging across centuries into the DNA of a single living person today. And the model went further. It calculated that there is greater than a 50% probability that at least one of those European ancestors was born more recently than 1835, meaning for a shockingly large number of African Americans, the violent origin of European ancestry in their bloodline isn't a distant, faded memory of the colonial era. It's within living memory of enslavement itself, sometimes just 2 or 3 generations removed from someone who could have personally recalled it. The revelations didn't stop at African American communities either, and this next part flips the entire narrative on its head. Researchers running the same ancestry algorithms on a separate data set, roughly 78,000 people who identified as being entirely of European descent, found something almost nobody expected. Somewhere between 3 and 4% of them carried detectable African ancestry, hidden in their genome, unknown to them, unclaimed by their family history. In most cases, the amount was small, often less than 1%, suggesting a single African ancestor who lived roughly 6 generations back, around 200 years ago. But the implication is enormous. For centuries, American racial categorization operated on a rigid, often violent binary, a system some historians call hypodescent, or the so-called one-drop rule, which legally and socially classified anyone with any known black ancestry as black, regardless of appearance. Yet the genetic data now shows that the reverse and far quieter phenomenon also happened continuously throughout American history. People with African ancestry, whether through deliberate choice to escape the brutal realities of racial oppression in a practice historically known as passing, or through ancestry so distant it was simply lost to family memory, blended into populations that today consider themselves entirely European in origin. The wall Americans built around racial categories, enforced through European family tree, and instead finding an unexplained African segment sitting quietly in their genome, a biological echo of a decision made by an ancestor who believed, correctly, that admitting the truth could cost them everything, including their life. So why does any of this actually matter beyond satisfying curiosity or reshaping a family tree app? Because this research sits at the crossroads of some of the most consequential questions in modern medicine and social science. Geneticists studying African American populations have found that genetic ancestry correlates with real, measurable differences in disease risk and outcomes for conditions ranging from obesity to hypertension to certain cancers, not because of the antiquated and false idea of biological race, but because ancestry can correlate with which specific gene variants a person carries, variants that arose and became common in specific ancestral populations, for reasons related to disease, resistance, diet, and environment over tens of thousands of years. One striking finding from a large pooled study of over 15,000 African American participants found that a higher percentage of European ancestry correlated statistically with lower body mass index and identified specific genetic loci on chromosome 5 and the X chromosome tied to this pattern. This is precision medicine's next frontier, and it only works if genetic research fully accounts for the real, complex, and mixed ancestry of real populations, rather than treating African American as a single uniform genetic category, which the data conclusively proves it is not. Ignoring this, complexity in medical research isn't just scientifically lazy. It can and does lead to misdiagnosis, ineffective treatment, and the perpetuation of health disparities that already disproportionately harm Black communities in America. For decades, clinical algorithms used in everything from kidney function tests to lung capacity measurements built crude, blunt, racial categories directly into their equations, treating Black and white as clean biological switches, rather than the messy, individually variable genetic mosaics that population geneticists now know they actually are. Patients were sometimes denied organ transplant referrals, or had their symptoms deprioritized because a formula assumed their organs functioned differently purely based on a checkbox on an intake form, not based on their actual individually sequenced genome. The admixture research described here offers a way out of that crude system entirely. A future where a doctor doesn't ask what race a patient identifies as, but instead looks at their actual ancestry informed. There's also a deeper, almost poetic irony buried in all of this, one that connects directly back to humanity's very beginning. The regions of West and Central Africa that this entire investigation traces back to are part of the continent that carries the greatest human genetic diversity on the mannerisms across an ocean and a language barrier that once seemed absolute. Countries including Ghana have built entire cultural and tourism initiatives, sometimes called Year of Return programs, specifically inviting members of the African diaspora to reconnect with ancestral homelands, initiatives that gained enormous emotional and practical momentum, precisely because genetic testing, reparative legislation, but through the quiet, patient work of population geneticists reading four-letter code with a rigor history's record keepers never applied to the enslaved people they exploited. What makes this entire body of research so profound isn't a single shocking statistic or a single surprising percentage. It's the accumulation of all of it together. The sex-biased violence written permanently onto the X chromosome, the internal slave trade hidden inside a Nigerian ancestry surplus, the malaria and mortality quietly erasing an entire Senegambian lineage, the whitening policies of Latin America, engineering a demographic outcome the shipping records alone could never predict, the hidden Africans. Historians already suspected about the transatlantic slave trade. It added a layer of individual, biological truth to a history that, for centuries, was told almost entirely through the paperwork, profit margins, and property records of the people who committed the crime, rather than through the voices and lineages of the people who survived it. For the first time, the descendants themselves hold direct, physical, undeniable evidence written into their own cells, evidence that cannot be burned, cannot be legislated away, and cannot be erased by anyone who might prefer this history stay buried. Every strand of DNA carried by roughly 47 million African Americans today is, quite literally, a survivor's testimony. It survived the Middle Passage. It survived plantation auction blocks that tore families apart with the same indifference used to sell livestock. It survived Jim Crow, survived forced migrations north during the Great Migration, survived attempts at erasure both violent and bureaucratic. And now, in laboratories using tools that didn't exist even 20 years ago, it is finally being allowed to speak. It doesn't speak in words. It speaks in the quiet mathematics of shared genetic segments in the coastlines it can point back to, in the sex-biased patterns that confirm crimes the perpetrators never recorded in writing. Somewhere in Senegal, in Nigeria, in Angola, in the Congo, there are living communities today, unknowingly connected by blood to millions of people across the ocean who share their ancestry but were never allowed to know their names. Science, for all its cold precision, has managed to do something extraordinarily human. It has given descendants of the enslaved a form of testimony their ancestors were never permitted to leave behind themselves. It has turned biology into memory, and memory into a form of justice that no courtroom could ever fully deliver. Carry your story well. It has come a very long way. Sources consulted. Bryce et al. Genome-wide patterns of population structure and admixture in West Africans and African Americans. Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, 2009. Para et al. Estimating African American admixture. Proportions by use of population-specific alleles. American Journal of Human Genetics, Baharian et al. Consequences of the Transatlantic Slave Trade in the Americas, American Journal of Human Genetics, 2020, and related CNN, NBC News, and Science Daily coverage. 23andMe blog, The Genetic Impact of the Transatlantic Slave Trade, and learn about hidden African DNA and ancestry. 23andMe. Research Institute press release on the 250-plus high-resolution African genetic groups expansion, November 2025. Admixture mapping study on BMI and chromosome loci in African Americans, PLOS genetics, not to be read aloud.